The morning Adelaide Merriweather sold her last jar of strawberry preserves before noon, she finally understood that something unusual was happening with the broad-shouldered rancher, who had been buying her entire table clear every single Saturday for the past 3 months. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a rough stone, half buried in red dust, a place where cattle drivers and gamblers and merchants all elbowed each other for space on the same muddy main street. The Saturday market had been running since the town was little more than a collection of wagon wheel ruts and wishful thinking, and Adelaide had been setting up her table near the old feed store since the spring following her husband Thomas's death from a fever 2 years prior. She had a small farmstead a few miles east of town, 20 acres of land that Thomas had loved more than was probably reasonable, and she had turned the kitchen garden into something remarkable out of sheer necessity. She made preserves from everything she could grow or gather: strawberry in June, then wild plum, then peach when the peach trees her father-in-law had planted years before came in heavy and gold. She put up tomato preserves and green tomato jam and apple butter from the old gnarled trees at the far edge of the property, and she did blackberry in late July with enough care that the seeds hardly troubled you at all. She had a talent for it, everyone said so, and her jars with their white cloth caps tied down with kitchen twine were among the most popular things at the Caldwell Saturday market. But no matter how popular her preserves were with the ladies of the town and the occasional traveler passing through on the trail, none of them bought like Stephen Boone. She had first noticed him in July, the week she brought 12 jars of wild plum to market and fully expected to be packing 4 or 5 of them home again. He had appeared out of the crowd the way large, quiet men sometimes do, suddenly just there without any particular ceremony, wearing a clean but worn canvas coat despite the heat, and a hat that had clearly seen considerable weather. He was perhaps 35, she had guessed, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone bluffs that lined the Cimarron River. He had looked at her table with those steady dark eyes of his, and then he had said very simply, "I'll take all of it." Adelaide had thought he was joking. She had laughed a little, the way you do when you think someone is being clever. "All 12 jars?" she had asked. "Yes, ma'am," he had said, and produced from his coat a leather purse that made a satisfying heavy sound when he set it on the corner of her table, and he had counted out the exact correct amount without her needing to say the price twice. She had watched him load those 12 jars of wild plum preserves into a canvas sack with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to apply to everything, and he had tipped his hat to her and walked away through the market crowd, and Adelaide had stood there for a moment feeling both grateful and slightly bewildered. He had come back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and every single Saturday since. She had started bringing more because it seemed foolish not to. If Stephen Boone of the Triple Bar B Ranch, which was what people told her his operation was called, wanted to buy 12 jars of preserves every week, then she would bring 12 jars, then 14, then as many as the week's work allowed. He always bought every single one, never haggled, never asked what kind it was, just looked at what she had, said he would take the lot, and paid her fairly and without complaint. By October, Adelaide Merriweather had begun to wonder what on God's green earth a man who ran cattle and employed at least half a dozen hands was doing with that much fruit preserve. It was on a cool Saturday morning in late October, with the smell of wood smoke hanging low over the market, and the cottonwood trees along the creek turned yellow as old paper, that she decided to ask him. She had brought 16 jars that morning, a mix of apple butter and the last of the late-season tomato preserve, and she had arranged them carefully on her table with the cloth caps facing forward the way she always did. The market was busy, the kind of busy that happened when the weather started to turn and people began thinking about laying in supplies for winter, and Adelaide had already turned away 2 other customers by the time Stephen Boone appeared at the edge of her table at 9:30, the same time he always arrived, with the same steadiness about him. "Good morning, Mrs. Merriweather," he said. He always said that. His voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary volume. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said. She always said that too, and then she told him what she had and he said he would take all of it, and that was the whole of every conversation they had ever had. But this morning Adelaide straightened up from where she had been adjusting a jar and looked at him directly. He was perhaps a head taller than her, with the kind of physical steadiness that came from years of hard outdoor work, and up close his eyes were a very dark brown, almost black, with a quality of attention in them that she found slightly unsettling in a way she had not entirely examined. "Mr. Boone," she said, "I have a question if you do not mind." Something shifted in his expression, not alarm exactly, but a particular kind of careful attention. "Of course," he said. "What do you do with all of it?" she asked. "The preserves. You have bought, I believe, somewhere close to 130 jars in the last 3.5 months, and I am genuinely curious what one man and his ranch hands are doing with that quantity of fruit preserve." He was quiet for a moment that went on just slightly too long, and Adelaide watched his jaw tighten the way a man's does when he is deciding something. "I give some to the hands," he said finally. "And the cook uses it in the kitchen." Adelaide tilted her head slightly. 130 jars, she repeated pleasantly. "The cook is enthusiastic," Stephen Boone said, and it was so clearly not true that Adelaide almost laughed again, the same instinctive laugh as that first day with the wild plum. "Mr. Boone," she said, with the directness that 12 years of homesteading and 2 years of widowhood had given her, "do you actually like preserves?" The silence that followed was so complete that the noise of the market around them seemed to recede. A horse stamped somewhere behind her. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Stephen Boone looked at Adelaide Merriweather with an expression she could not quite read, something complicated happening behind his steady dark eyes. "No," he said. "I do not." Adelaide stared at him. "I do not like preserves particularly," he said again, as though saying it a second time would somehow make it more reasonable. "I find them too sweet. The texture is not to my preference." "Then why," Adelaide said, slowly and with great care, "have you spent the better part of 4 months buying every single jar I bring to market?" Stephen Boone took the brim of his hat off and turned it once in his hands, a gesture she had never seen from him before, and she realized with a small shock that it was nervous. This large, steady, deliberate man was nervous. "Because," he said, and then stopped. "Because," Adelaide prompted very gently, because she could see that whatever was happening inside him was genuine and considerable. "Because it was the only excuse I could think of to come and stand at your table for 5 minutes every Saturday morning," he said, "and I could not think of a better one." The world did not stop exactly. The market went on around them. A child shrieked with laughter somewhere near the candy stall. A wagon wheel creaked past. But Adelaide Merriweather felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been pressed very flat for a long time, something she had stopped expecting to feel again. She looked at Stephen Boone for a long moment. He was looking back at her with the same directness he always had, but stripped now of the careful neutrality he usually maintained, and what was underneath it was something that looked very much like hope held at a careful distance, the way you hold a lamp against the wind to keep it from going out. "Mr. Boone," she said finally, "you could have just said good morning." "I am aware of that," he said. "In retrospect. You spent over 3 months and a considerable amount of money on fruit preserve you do not like." "I did." "What did you do with all of it?" He put his hat back on. "I have been giving it to the Hendersons up on the North Quarter," he said, with a kind of resigned honesty that was somehow more charming than anything polished could have been. "They have 8 children and the father broke his leg in June. They have been very grateful. I believe Mrs. Henderson thinks I am extraordinarily generous." Adelaide pressed her lips together against a smile that was building with considerable force. And the hands. I gave them some. They complained it was too sweet. I agreed. I gave the rest to the Hendersons. The smile broke through entirely. It had been a long time since Adelaide had smiled like that, full and unguarded, and she could see from the way Stephen Boone's expression changed that it affected him considerably. "Well," she said, "that is the most elaborate and inadvertently charitable excuse for a conversation I have ever heard of." "It was not my finest planning," he agreed. She looked down at her 16 jars of apple butter and tomato preserve, and then back up at him. "The Hendersons must be very well stocked by now." "Extraordinarily," he said. "Then perhaps," Adelaide said, with more courage than she had expected to find in herself at that particular moment, "you might come and say good morning, without the jars, and we could find something else to talk about." Stephen Boone looked at her for a moment with an intensity that made her heart knock once hard against her ribs. "I would like that very much," he said, "if you would permit it." "I would," she said simply. He bought all 16 jars anyway, out of what she supposed was habit or stubbornness or both. And then he stood at her table for another 20 minutes, and they talked about things other than preserves for the first time. About the fall weather, and the cattle drive that had just come through and left the main street considerably the worse for it. About the way the light fell on the Cimarron Bluffs in October. About her farm and his ranch, and the particular character of the Kansas wind, when it came down out of the north in November. And Adelaide discovered that Stephen Boone, when he was not maintaining the careful professional neutrality of a man conducting a transaction he was not being honest about, was thoughtful and dry-humored and attentive in a way that made time move strangely. When he finally left, tipping his hat in the way she had seen him do every week, she watched him walk back through the market crowd and felt something warm and slightly frightening settle into her chest. She drove home that afternoon in her wagon with her money and her empty table and her heart doing things she had not prepared herself for, and she tried to be sensible about it, the way a widow of 32 with a farm to run and a reputation to maintain in a cattle town ought to be sensible. She was not a girl. She knew the weight of the word sensible and how much it cost. But she thought about his face when he had said he did not like preserves, the way the admission had come out of him like something he had been carrying too long, and she thought about 130 jars going to the Henderson family's 8 children, and she was not entirely successful at sensible. The following Saturday was the 1st of November, cold enough that she could see her breath, and she brought 14 jars of apple butter and the elderberry preserve she had made at the very end of September and been saving because it was particularly good that year, she thought. She put on her good gray wool dress and her decent bonnet, and she told herself firmly that this was not because of anything in particular. Stephen Boone arrived at 9:30, same as always, but this time he came directly to her table, and he was not alone. Beside him was a boy of perhaps 12, gangly and dark-haired with the same set to his jaw, and the boy was looking at everything in the market with the bright, comprehensive interest of a child who does not get to town often. "Mrs. Merriweather," Stephen said, "this is my son, Robert." The boy pulled his hat off with a promptness that suggested it had been drilled into him. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. Adelaide felt something in her chest go very soft in a way she had not anticipated. "Good morning, Robert," she said warmly. "That is a very fine hat." The boy grinned at that, sudden and brilliant, and she could see his father in it completely. "Pa says I can get a peppermint stick at the candy stall," he offered, clearly feeling that this was important information. "That sounds like a very good use of a Saturday morning," Adelaide agreed. She looked at Stephen, who was watching her with a careful expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite succeeding, and she understood that bringing the boy had been a deliberate thing, that it was his way of being honest about the whole of who he was. She had known, in the way that small towns make sure you know things, that Stephen Boone was a widower. His wife, Eleanor, had died 4 years ago of a difficult childbirth, and the child had not survived either. He had been raising Robert alone since then, with the help of a housekeeper named Mrs. Garrity who came out from town 3 days a week. This was the kind of knowledge that circulated through Caldwell in the way that all important knowledge did, through the women at the market and the men at the feed store and the conversations that happened over back fences. Adelaide had known it the way she knew everything about the town, at a distance, as information rather than as something that had any particular bearing on her life. Now, standing here with the cold November wind cutting through the market stalls and Robert Boone looking longingly toward the candy stall, it did not feel like distant information at all. "Go on, then," Stephen told his son, and produced a coin, and the boy was gone with considerable speed. Stephen turned back to Adelaide. In the cold morning light, with the wind lifting the edge of his coat collar, he looked like someone who had made a decision and was standing in it. "I wanted to be straightforward with you," he said, "about Robert, about what my situation is." "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it fully. "He is a good boy," Stephen said, with the particular quiet fierceness of a man who loves something more than he has words for. "He has excellent manners and a good sense of priorities," Adelaide said. The peppermint stick was very reasonably placed. The corner of Stephen's mouth moved. "He has been curious about you," he said. "I may have mentioned you once or twice." "Only once or twice?" Adelaide asked. "Perhaps somewhat more than that." She straightened one of the jars on her table for no particular reason. "And what did you mention?" "That the lady at the preserve table is very kind and very skilled," he said, and then, after a pause that had weight to it, "and that I find her company to be the best part of my week." Adelaide Merriweather looked up at Stephen Boone in the cold November morning, with the market noise around them and the smell of wood smoke in the air, and she thought about Thomas, who had been a good man, and whom she had loved genuinely, and who was 2 years gone, and buried under the cottonwood he had planted himself at the corner of the east field. She thought about the loneliness of the farmhouse in winter, which was a particular and thorough kind of loneliness that no amount of useful work entirely displaced. She thought about last Saturday and the way her heart had felt when she drove home. "Mr. Boone," she said, "my name is Adelaide." He was quiet for a moment that was not empty but full. "Stephen," he said. "Stephen," she repeated, and the word felt entirely natural in her mouth, which surprised her. "If you would like to come and see the farm sometime, I believe the apple trees are still worth looking at before the winter sets in entirely." "I would like that," he said, "very much." Robert returned with his peppermint stick and examined the preserves with the careful disinterest of a 12-year-old, who is trying to appear more sophisticated than his interest in candy suggests, and he asked Adelaide what the elderberry preserve tasted like, and she gave him a small taste on the back of a clean spoon she kept for exactly that purpose, and he considered it with great seriousness, and said it was good but probably not as good as peppermint. And Adelaide told him that was a completely fair assessment, and that different things were best for different occasions. Stephen bought all 14 jars. He did it with a slight look of resignation, as though he understood the absurdity of the habit by this point and had decided to own it. "You could stop," Adelaide pointed out. "I could," he agreed, and handed her the money, and she watched him pack the jars into the canvas sack with the same unhurried competence as always. "The Hendersons will be well set for winter," she observed. "They will be," he said gravely. She was still smiling when she drove home. He came to the farm the following Thursday, riding out on a bay horse that moved well and behaved itself, and Adelaide met him at the gate in her work clothes with her hands still dusty from the kitchen, because she had been putting up the last of the onions, and she had decided firmly not to change because this was her farm and he was coming to see it, not her in her best dress, and if that was not something he could accommodate, then better to know it now. He looked at her in her work clothes and dusty hands, and the expression on his face was straightforward and warm enough that she felt her own straightforwardness confirmed. She showed him the farm the way she was proud of it, not apologetically. 20 acres was not large, but it was well kept. the kitchen garden winterized with straw mulch, the root cellar full of the summer's work, the apple trees silver and bare now, but with the structure of good fruit-bearing trees, the old orchard that Thomas's father had planted 30 years before on a bet with himself that apples would grow in Kansas if you loved them enough. He was right, Stephen said, looking at the trees. He usually was, from what Thomas told me, Adelaide said. He was that kind of man. They walked along the orchard row and Stephen asked sensible questions about the property, the kind that showed he understood land, and Adelaide answered them honestly, including the parts about the east fence that needed repair and the fact that the well went slightly low in August and she needed to watch it in dry years. "How do you manage it?" he asked. It was not a challenging question. It was genuinely curious, the way a man who respects work asks about work. "With difficulty and determination," she said, "and I hire the Watson boy for heavy things. He is 15 and strong and glad to earn money. And the preserves business." "Yes," she said. Thomas left things in order, but in order for one person is not quite the same as in order for two. "I make do." He nodded at that with what seemed like understanding. They had reached the corner of the east field where the cottonwood stood, still holding a few yellow leaves at the very top, and Adelaide stopped there because it seemed natural to, and she did not explain why, but she thought he probably understood. They stood in the quiet of the late fall afternoon, the sun going orange over the western horizon, and the wind moved the last leaves of the cottonwood and something settled between them, easy and unforced, the kind of ease you do not manufacture. "I like your farm," he said. "I like it too," she said. "It cost me a great deal to keep it, but I am glad I kept it." He turned to look at her in the last of the orange afternoon light, and she could see that he was a careful man by nature, that he moved through the world with a deliberateness that was not coldness but its opposite, attention paid fully and not wasted. She thought that was a good quality in a person. She thought quite a few things about Stephen Boone standing there in the light of the late October sun that she filed away to examine later. "Would you and Robert come to supper?" she heard herself say. "Sunday, if the weather holds." "We would," he said, with the plainness of someone who does not dress up a yes with unnecessary words. She cooked Sunday supper with more care than she usually gave it, which she acknowledged to herself as entirely voluntary and entirely her own choice. She made a proper roast with the last of the fall vegetables and cornbread and pie, which she knew was a great deal of food for 3 people, but the boy was 12 and boys of 12 eat considerably. Robert ate 3 pieces of cornbread and talked steadily through the whole meal about horses, which were clearly his primary passion, and about a particular black gelding at the ranch named Midnight that he was being allowed to work with, and about the way his father had shown him to read the sky for weather. Adelaide listened to all of this with genuine interest and asked questions that Robert answered with authority and pleasure. Stephen ate with the appreciation of a man who had been taking his meals mostly from a ranch cook for 4 years and said so, without excessive flattery, just honest enjoyment, and Adelaide was more pleased by that than by compliments would have been. After supper Robert went to look at the horses in the small barn, having asked permission and received it, and Adelaide and Stephen sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and the kitchen was warm from the stove and the last light was going blue outside the window, and it was the most comfortable Adelaide had felt inside her own house in longer than she could precisely remember. "He is wonderful," she said about Robert, because it was true and she wanted to say it. Stephen looked at his coffee cup. "He needs a mother," he said quietly. "I do not say that to put pressure on you. I say it because it is true and because I want to be honest with you. I have been being honest with you for some time now in my way." "In your way," Adelaide said gently. "Your way involved a great many jars of preserves." "It did," he agreed and looked up at her. "I am not a man who finds words easy. I want you to know that about me." "I find the actions quite clear enough," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slightly on the table. "Eleanor died 4 years ago," he said. "She was a good woman. I was a good husband to her. I would want you to know that too." "I believe it," Adelaide said, and she did, looking at him and knowing what she knew of him by now. "I have not tried to know another woman since," he said. "I have been occupied, and I was not ready. And then I came to the market in July to buy some tobacco, and I saw you, and I was ready." Adelaide Merriweather looked at Stephen Boone across her kitchen table and felt the full settled weight of what he was saying, not a young man's impulsive declaration, but something built from 4 years of patience and the deliberate choice of a deliberate person. She thought about her own 2 years of widowhood, the solitary mornings and the work that filled the days but did not fill everything, and the way she had stopped expecting something and then, one Saturday in October, discovered that she had been wrong to stop. "I think," she said, "that you ought to come back next Sunday, and the Sunday after that." "I will," he said. "We both will." He did. They both did. And the Sundays became the organizing structure of Adelaide's weeks in a way she had not had since Thomas was alive, something to work toward, something that made the weeks work more purposeful because there was a shape to it. She learned Stephen Boone by degrees. The way you learn someone when you are both past 30 and have had full lives before. And there is no urgency because the urgency is not in the destination, but in the knowing. She learned that he read more than she would have expected, keeping a small shelf of books in his study that included histories and a volume of poetry by Longfellow that he admitted to owning with the slight defensiveness of a man who thinks it might not be considered appropriately masculine, but has decided not to care. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri 15 years ago with 2 horses and $40, and the kind of stubbornness that either kills you or makes you rich, and he had been lucky and stubborn in more or less equal measure. She learned that he was a good employer, that his ranch hands had mostly been with him for years, and that he paid fairly and expected hard work, and was known as a man whose word meant what it said. She learned from Robert, who confided things without entirely meaning to in the way that 12-year-olds do, that his father had started dressing with more care on Saturday mornings sometime in the summer, and that he had tried once to taste the wild plum preserve and made a face like something terrible was happening. Adelaide had laughed at that until her sides hurt. She told Stephen. He bore it with dignity. By December, the whole town of Caldwell was aware that Stephen Boone was courting Adelaide Merriweather, because Caldwell was not a town that missed these things, and the opinion was generally favorable, the women at the market expressing their approval with the warmth that small towns reserve for romances that seem right, and the men at the feed store saying nothing explicit about it, but offering Stephen occasional knowing nods that he received without comment. There was one complication, and Adelaide had been aware of it for some time with the clear-eyed honesty that was her nature. Her friend Martha Caldwell, no relation to the town's name, who had the dry goods stall next to Adelaide's at the market, and who had been married 3 times to progressively less satisfactory men, and had thus become an expert on the subject of men generally, had sat Adelaide down in November and said, with the plainness of genuine friendship, "He is a good man, Adelaide, but you need to be sure it is what you want and not just what solves the problem of being alone." Adelaide had thought about that for a long time. In the honest, careful way she thought about important things. She had thought about it on the Thursday evenings when she was putting up the kitchen for the night and the house was quiet and the wind was outside the window, and she was genuinely by herself, not with the memory of Thomas or the anticipation of Sunday, but truly alone. She had asked herself what she felt when she thought about Stephen Boone, and the answer was not the wild, tender fever of first young love, and she did not expect it to be, and did not want it exactly. What she felt was warmth and interest and the particular pleasure of someone whose company fits you, like a well-made coat, and the desire to know more of him and to be more fully known, and the way her heart had knocked against her ribs when he looked at her that first day without the careful neutrality. And she thought that was real, and she thought it was enough, and she thought it was actually more than she had expected from any second chapter of her life. She told Martha so, and Martha, who could be astringent but was never unkind about what actually mattered, had nodded and said, "Good. Then stop overthinking it and let the man hold your hand." He had, in fact, already held her hand. Once in November, walking back from the orchard along the rutted path, he had offered his hand to help her over a muddy section and had not let go of it after, and they had walked the last 100 yards to the barn with their hands together, and neither of them had commented on it. And Adelaide had felt that particular warmth spreading up her arm and through her whole chest like the first cup of coffee on a cold morning. He kissed her on a December evening, standing in the lamplight of her front porch after Sunday supper, with the temperature below freezing and their breath making small clouds in the dark air. He had looked at her for a moment with that particular directness, as though asking a question that he already suspected the answer to, and she had answered it without words by staying entirely still and looking back, and he had kissed her with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his size and the general granite quality of his exterior, the way a man kisses when he means it and is being careful with something he values. Adelaide had held onto the front porch post with one hand for balance. Not because she was faint precisely, just because the world had shifted on its axis by a small but significant degree. "Good night, Adelaide," he had said. "Good night, Stephen," she had said, and gone inside and stood in the warm kitchen for a long moment before she could make herself do anything as practical as banking the stove. Christmas came to Caldwell with an inch of hard snow that turned the cattle trail into a silver ribbon and made the cottonwoods along the creek look like they were made of glass. Adelaide drove to town on Christmas Eve for the church service, which she had attended every year since coming to Caldwell because it was right, and because she found the singing a comfort regardless of theology, and she found Stephen and Robert already in the pew where she had begun to sit with them over the past several Sundays. Robert had combed his hair with water and was wearing his Sunday coat, and had the particular scrubbed and slightly martyred look of a boy who has been made to be presentable. He moved over to make room for her without being asked, and when the candles were lit and the congregation stood to sing, Adelaide heard Stephen's voice beside her for the first time in a hymn and found it unexpectedly true, a low, steady baritone that did not perform but simply sang, and she thought that was entirely consistent with everything she knew of him. After the service, there was the usual gathering in the church yard, and Adelaide stood with Stephen and introduced him to people she knew, and he introduced her to people he knew, and they were standing together in the natural way of two people who belong in the same space, and several of the older women in town looked at them with a particular approving satisfaction that Adelaide pretended not to notice. They exchanged gifts on Christmas morning, driving out to the Triple Bar B Ranch, which Adelaide had been to several times by then, but which still impressed her with its scale. The main house solidly built from stone and timber, the barns well maintained, the operation running with the unhurried competence of something that has been correctly built from the start. She had made him a scarf of dark blue wool, because she had noticed he did not have one, and the Kansas winters required one. And she had made Robert a pair of good, thick riding gloves because the boy was going to be on horseback regardless of the temperature and might as well have proper hands. Stephen gave her a small and beautiful box made of dark wood with a hinged lid, and inside it was a set of glass preserve jars, the good heavy kind that sealed properly, 12 of them nested in straw. She looked at him. "They are good jars," he said with a perfectly maintained expression. "For the preserves." "For the preserves," she repeated. "Which are excellent," he said, "and which I intend to continue funding in perpetuity, regardless of my personal preferences." "You are going to keep buying them, aren't you? Until I can think of a better reason to come and see you on Saturday mornings," he said, "at which point the arrangement may change." Robert, who had been trying his gloves on with great satisfaction, looked up and said, "He means he is going to ask you to marry him," with the particular candor of a 12-year-old who does not see why adults have to take so long getting to the point. Stephen looked at his son with an expression of extreme parental suffering. Adelaide looked at Robert with enormous fondness. "Is that so?" she said. "He practices what he is going to say sometimes," Robert reported cheerfully, "when he thinks I am asleep." "I am going to sell that horse," Stephen said. "You are not," Robert said, entirely untroubled. Adelaide was laughing again, the full, unguarded laugh that she had laughed too little in the past 2 years, and the ranch kitchen was warm around them with the smell of Christmas breakfast and pine from the small tree Mrs. Garrity had insisted on, and she thought that this was a very good Christmas. She thought it might be the start of many good Christmases. January was cold and hard the way January in Kansas always is, with the wind coming down from the north with nothing to stop it, and the cattle trail was mostly quiet, and the town of Caldwell pulled inward around its stoves and waited for spring. Adelaide worked her farmstead and made preserves from the preserved and dried fruit she had laid in, the careful craft of winter preserving, citrus when she could get it, spiced apple and pear that would be wonderful in spring when the fresh jars ran out. Stephen came on Sundays, and sometimes on Thursdays, and twice he came in the middle of a weekday because there was something on his range that brought him near her road and he stopped. Those unplanned visits were her favorite, she admitted to herself, because they had the quality of something that could not wait, and she found that she could not pretend that did not matter to her. On a Thursday in late January, he came to find her mending the east fence, the one she had told him about in the fall, alone with a hammer and wire, and the fierce practical determination that had gotten her through 2 years of widowhood. She heard his horse on the road and looked up, and there he was, and he swung down without ceremony and came to look at what she was doing and said, "Let me," with the simple directness of a man who is not trying to rescue her but is present and capable and wants to help. She thought about saying she could manage, because she could, and because she had been managing alone for long enough that the management was a point of pride. But she handed him the wire stretcher because his hands were bigger and stronger and it would take half the time, and they worked the fence together in the cold January air without much talk, and when it was done he coiled the extra wire and she put away the tools and they stood looking at the repaired fence with the satisfaction of a thing properly done. "Thank you," she said. "It needed doing," he said. "I had it in hand." "I know you did," he said. "I just wanted to help." She looked at him. "I am not used to help," she said honestly. "I have not had it for 2 years." "I know," he said. "I did not mean to overstep." "You did not," she said. "I am just telling you where I am." "So you know." He looked at her steadily for a moment and said, "I know where you are. I am not going to try to change you. I just want to be beside you." Adelaide Merriweather stood in the cold January field beside the fence they had just repaired together and understood, with a clarity she trusted completely, that what she felt for Stephen Boone was love. Not the tentative early warmth she had been calling it to herself for caution's sake, but the real thing, settled and true, the kind that is not frightened by itself. She stepped forward and took his hand, the way she had not taken it but let him take it in November, and she held it and felt his grip firm around hers, strong and warm and certain. "I believe," she said carefully, "that when you are ready to say what Robert tells me you have been practicing, I will be ready to hear it." Stephen Boone looked at her for a long moment in the cold winter light, and what she saw on his face was something she would remember exactly the way you remember moments that contain your whole life in miniature. "Adelaide," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her then, in the January field with the repaired fence behind them and the cold wind around them and the bare cottonwood at the corner standing silent. And it was not a gentle exploring kiss like the first one on the porch but something more certain, the kiss of a decision made and a future opened. And Adelaide held onto his coat front with both hands and kissed him back with the same certainty. When they separated she was breathing a little fast and her cheeks were warm despite the cold, and Stephen was looking at her with the expression she had first seen that day in October when the careful neutrality had fallen away, but wider now, no longer holding anything back. "We should tell Robert," she said. "He already knows," Stephen said. "He will be insufferable about it." "He will be wonderful about it," Adelaide said firmly. Robert was, in fact, both. They were married in March of 1879, in the Caldwell church on the first genuinely warm day the spring had produced, with the smell of new grass coming through the open church windows and the cottonwoods beginning to haze green along the creek. Martha from the dry goods stall sat in the front row and cried with the thorough dedication of someone who has been waiting for this for months and intends to honor the occasion fully. Robert stood beside his father and was solemn and beautiful with his hair combed flat, and his good coat on, and his jaw set with the same angle as Stephen's, and Adelaide thought she had never seen a more remarkable-looking pair of people in her life. Adelaide wore her best dress, which she had let out and taken in and otherwise modified for the occasion, the dark green wool that had been Thomas's favorite, and which she had decided was simply her best dress, and Thomas would have wanted her to wear it to something important. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers she had saved from the summer before, because fresh flowers were not yet available, and she had made them beautiful with ribbon and care. Reverend Howell, who was a practical man and had been performing weddings in Caldwell since the town was young, kept the ceremony straightforward and genuine, the way Adelaide had asked him to, and she said the words to Stephen, and Stephen said the words back to her with his eyes on her face the entire time, not looking down at Reverend Howell or at the congregation, but at her, as though the words were entirely for her and the rest was circumstance. When Reverend Howell said they were married, Stephen took her face in both his large hands with a careful tenderness that made the church absolutely quiet, and kissed her, and the whole congregation made a sound of collective warmth that was better than any applause. Adelaide Merriweather became Adelaide Boone on the first warm Thursday in March, and the town of Caldwell ate the wedding cake that Martha had organized and drank the cider that the men at the feed store had contributed, and was genuinely glad in the unreserved way that small towns are glad when something good happens to people they care about. Moving to the Triple Bar B Ranch was the subject of some considerable practical discussion, because Adelaide's farmstead was not a small thing to simply close up. She and Stephen talked about it with the directness that was the best thing about how they communicated, and they agreed that her farm would be managed, not abandoned. Stephen had the hands and the resources to maintain it through the growing season, and the kitchen garden and orchards would continue to produce, and Adelaide would continue to make preserves. This was non-negotiable as far as Adelaide was concerned, and Stephen had not suggested otherwise. "The Saturday market," he said in the tone of a man confirming something important. "I will be there every Saturday," she said. "It is mine." "I know it is," he said. "I will drive you," she looked at him. "Or you can drive yourself," he said. "I will come along." "To buy the preserves, to not buy the preserves," he said with perfect gravity. "I believe we have established that the transaction was never really about the preserves. The Hendersons may notice a decline in their supply." "I have spoken to Mr. Henderson," Stephen said. "He is recovered from his leg. He is managing. They will be fine." Adelaide put her hand over her mouth and then let the laugh come. "You actually told him?" "I told him that circumstances had changed, and my generosity in the preserve department might be somewhat reduced going forward," Stephen said, with the long-suffering expression of a man who has made several poor choices and is now accounting for them with honesty. "What did he say?" "He laughed for a very long time," Stephen said. "He said he had wondered. He said his wife had thought I must be the most preserve-obsessed man in the Kansas Territory." Adelaide moved into the ranch house in March, and it was larger than her farmstead by a considerable measure, which required adjustment, but adjustment was something she was good at. Mrs. Garrity, the housekeeper, was a short, efficient woman of about 50 with red hair going gray and opinions about kitchen organization that were definite and well-founded. And she and Adelaide negotiated the kitchen with the careful diplomacy of two competent women deciding how to share a space. And after 2 weeks had arrived at an arrangement that worked because they were both practical and because they respected each other's abilities. Robert adjusted to having Adelaide in the house with the speed and completeness that 12-year-olds show when something is genuinely what they wanted, which is to say immediately and thoroughly. He started leaving things on the kitchen table for her to see, things he was interested in, a feather he had found, a piece of quartz from the creek, a drawing he had done of Midnight the horse, and Adelaide received these offerings with the genuine interest they deserved, because she was genuinely interested in him, not as a role to perform, but because he was a remarkable boy and his mind was quick, and his heart was good and she loved him. She had not been sure she would love him, going into it. She had not been sure because she had never had children of her own, and Thomas's death before that had happened had been a grief inside the grief, and she had not known if love for a child not born from her was a thing she was capable of. She found with Robert that it was not a question at all. It just was. She told Stephen this one evening in April when Robert was in bed and they were sitting on the porch in the first real spring warmth, his arm around her shoulders and her head against his jaw, watching the stars over the Kansas plain. He did not say anything for a moment but held her a little tighter, and she felt his breath even out the way it did when he was moved and trying to contain it, and she understood that she had given him something important. "He loves you too," Stephen said, very quietly. "I know," she said, equally quietly. "You are everything I hoped," he said, "everything and more." Adelaide turned to look at him in the starlight, at the strong jaw and the dark eyes, and the particular quality of steadiness that was the most fundamentally Stephen thing about him. And she thought about a July Saturday when a man she had never seen before had looked at 12 jars of wild plum preserve and said he would take all of it. And she thought about the strange, generous absurdity of 130 jars finding their way to 8 children who needed them. And she thought about the moment in October when everything simple had become complicated, and then, quickly, simpler and better than it had been before. And she thought that love was frequently a stranger enterprise then. Any of the songs gave it credit for, and she was grateful for that. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it in those words, and she said it plainly, the way she did things. Stephen looked at her for a moment as though the words had entered him somewhere deep and were finding their way through. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since July in some form or another. I was not ready to say it clearly until now." "You communicated it tolerably well with the preserves," she said. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh that Stephen Boone produced, which was a low exhale with warmth in it, and a slight curve of the mouth that meant more than other people's full laughter. Spring on the Triple Barbie was different from spring on Adelaide's small farmstead, bigger in scale and faster in pace, with the cattle drive season starting, and the hands working long days and Stephen out before dawn and home after dark on the heavy weeks. Adelaide worked alongside this rhythm rather than against it, learning the shape of the ranch year the way she had learned the shape of her farm year, different but not incomprehensible. And she found she liked the scale of it, the sense of a large, purposeful operation, the way the land opened out to the horizon in all directions with the spring grass coming up gold green. She still went to the farm twice a week to oversee the kitchen garden and the orchard, driving the wagon herself, and she brought the produce back and worked the preserves in the ranch kitchen on the days when Mrs. Garrity was at her own home in town, and the jars accumulated on the preserve shelf with the satisfying weight of work done well. Saturday mornings she was at the market. Stephen drove her the first Saturday after they were married, pulling up to the market in the ranch wagon and helping her set up the table with the same unhurried competence he applied to everything. And the women of the market watched this with the same warm collective satisfaction as the church had shown at the wedding. He stood at a slight distance during the morning, talking to various men of the town, or simply standing with his coffee from the woman who sold it near the feed store. Not hovering but present. And Adelaide sold her preserves to the ladies of the town, and the travelers and the ranchers' wives who came in on Saturday. And she felt him there at the edge of her awareness, the way you feel warmth from a good fire, even when you are not looking directly at it. When the table was sold down to 4 jars, he came back. He looked at the 4 jars. He looked at Adelaide. "Do not," she said. "I was not going to," he said. "You were absolutely going to." He put his hand in his coat pocket, and she saw him make a deliberate decision to leave it there. "I have broken the habit," he said. "Have you?" "More or less," he said, and bought 2 jars, which he then gave directly to the woman at the next stall over who admired them, and Adelaide pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained until he turned around and then let it go entirely. "The Hendersons again?" she asked. "No," he said. "That was Mrs. Abbott. She mentioned they were her favorite." "Stephen, yes. You may never actually stop buying preserves you do not eat, may you?" "In all probability," he said seriously, "no." She took his arm as they walked back to the wagon, and she thought that there were worse qualities in a man than generosity expressed in an unusual form, and she thought that she was very happy, which was a word she used with care because she had learned what its absence felt like. Summer came to the ranch with the cattle drives and the heat and the long golden days, and Adelaide's farm produced abundantly, as it always had, the strawberries in June, and then the plums, and then the peaches coming in heavy as they had every year since Thomas's father had planted those trees on his bet with himself. She put up more preserves that summer than she ever had before, because she had the ranch kitchen and the help, and her Saturday table was full every week. Robert turned 13 in June and was given full responsibility for Midnight the Black Gelding, and the pride with which he communicated this to Adelaide over supper was a beautiful thing to watch. Stephen watched his son talk about the horse and looked at Adelaide across the table with an expression of quiet, profound contentment that she recognized because she felt it too, the particular happiness of a table that is full in the right way. One evening in July, Adelaide told Stephen that she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him simply, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamps lit and the summer night outside, because simplicity was how they dealt with important things. She watched his face as the information arrived in it, and what she saw was joy, immediate and unguarded, the kind of joy he did not produce often, and that was therefore extraordinary when it appeared. He came around the table to her, and she stood and he held her carefully, as though something precious had been added to the world, and she felt his heart beating against her temple and thought that this was a moment she would keep perfectly. "Are you well?" he asked with the particular concern of a man who lost his first wife in childbirth. "I am well," she said firmly, because she understood what the question carried. "I am healthy and practical, and I will be careful, and we will get Dr. Fielding for the time, and it will be fine." He held her a little tighter. "I know," he said. "I know it will." "Stephen," she said. "Yes." "It will be fine," she said again gently, and felt him breathe. Robert was informed the next morning at breakfast, and responded with a pure, uncomplicated gladness that filled the kitchen. "A baby," he said, as though this were a remarkable and excellent development that he was personally responsible for having arranged. "I will teach it to ride." "It will be some years before riding," Adelaide told him. "I will plan ahead," Robert said seriously, and Adelaide looked at Stephen and Stephen looked at Adelaide, and the laughter they shared across the table was the particular intimate laughter of two people who see the same thing at the same moment. The fall of 1879 arrived with its cottonwood gold and its wood smoke smell, and Adelaide's pregnancy was showing by September, and she continued to run her Saturday table and drive her wagon and manage her preserves with the determination that was simply her nature, accommodating necessity without making unnecessary drama of it. The women of Caldwell were warmly attentive, and Martha from the dry goods stall appointed herself an informal lookout and general supporter with the thoroughness of genuine friendship. Stephen was attentive in the way that suited both of them, not hovering but present, asking after her in the mornings, and watching her carefully without making her feel watched, checking that there was wood enough and water enough and warmth enough with the practical care of a man who expresses love through the making sure of things. He helped her with the November preserves himself, which she had not asked for. She had come into the kitchen one Saturday morning to find him reading the preserve recipe she had left out the night before with the focused attention of someone studying for an examination, and she had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him for a moment before he heard her. He looked up. "I am learning to make the apple butter," he said with complete seriousness. "You do not like apple butter," she pointed out. "I do not," he agreed. "But you should not be lifting the heavy pots, and Mrs. Garrity has a bad shoulder. So I am learning." Adelaide had stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something she did not have a word for, something larger than ordinary happiness and quieter than joy, something that lived in the domestic and the ordinary and was more real than anything dramatic. "The sugar goes in after the apples are soft," she said, coming into the kitchen. "Not before." "Right," he said, and turned back to the recipe with the focused attention he gave everything. She stood beside him at the stove that morning, and he did the lifting, and she directed, and together they made 4 dozen jars of apple butter that was, she admitted, as good as she made it herself, because he was a careful and precise learner and did nothing by halves. He tasted a spoonful when it was done with the expression of a man steeling himself, and then looked genuinely surprised. "That is," he said carefully, "not terrible." "High praise," she said. "It is less sweet than I expected. I use less sugar than most recipes. I prefer the fruit to come through." He looked at the jar he was holding and then at her with an expression of dawning horror. "I have been buying the version of preserves that I least dislike for 4 months before I spoke to you," he said. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "If I had tried someone else's preserves first, I might have decided I did not like preserves even sooner." "You might have. You make a significantly better product than I gave your category credit for." "Thank you," she said gravely. "I still do not like the texture of the berries." "Fair enough." He set the jar down and looked at her, and the expression on his face was so specifically, privately warm that she felt it like sunlight through glass. "Everything you make is worth keeping," he said, and she understood that he did not mean only the preserves. December came with harder frost and the baby was due in January, and Adelaide and Stephen had prepared with the thoroughness that characterized them both. Dr. Fielding had been spoken to and arrangements made. The baby's room, which had been a small spare room at the back of the ranch house, had been quietly transformed with a cradle that Stephen had made himself from timber over the fall evenings, working in the barn by lamplight with a careful skill. She had not known he had until she came out one evening and found him at it, planing a piece of oak with the focused piece of a man engaged in work that matters. She had stood in the barn doorway watching him, the lamplight warm on the pine walls and the smell of shavings in the cold air, and she had thought about Thomas, as she sometimes still did, without pain now but with a kind of quiet gratitude, because Thomas had been real and good and she would always carry him. And she thought he would have liked Stephen Boone, the steadiness and the honesty and the way he made the cradle as carefully as if the future child would be able to tell the difference. She thought Thomas would have been glad for her, which was a healing thought, and she let it be that. On the 14th of January, 1880, in the ranch house on the Triple Barbie with Dr. Fielding present and Mrs. Garrity and Martha, who had driven out from town, despite the cold and who had been absolutely impossible to dissuade from attending, Adelaide Boone delivered a son. He was large and healthy, loud in his opinions, and he had a small amount of dark hair and his father's jaw already, which seemed ambitious for a person who had been in existence for approximately 12 minutes. Adelaide held him and felt the enormous particular love of a new mother, which was a thing she had not expected at 32, and which arrived with the completeness that real things have, not a smaller version of something but its full self. Stephen came in when Dr. Fielding said he could, and stood at the bedside looking at his son with an expression that made every stoic quality of him seem briefly transparent. All the things he kept carefully inside himself visible at once in his face, love and wonder, and the particular grief of a man remembering what this cost him the first time, and finding that the world had given him this extraordinary second chance. Adelaide took his hand and he held it with both of his. "He looks like you," she said. "God help him," Stephen said softly, and she laughed, tired and warm and full. They named him James Thomas Boone, the Thomas for Adelaide's first husband and the James for Stephen's father, and the naming was Stephen's suggestion, which she had not expected, and which moved her to tears she had not entirely prepared for. "He should know where you came from," Stephen had said simply. "All the things that made you you are worth honoring." Robert met his brother with all the ceremony of a 13-year-old who has been waiting for this for 6 months and has been thinking about the riding lessons. He looked at James Thomas with great seriousness for a long moment and then said, "He is very red." "All babies are red," Adelaide told him. "Will he stay red?" "No," Adelaide said. "He will improve." Robert nodded, apparently relieved. "I will still teach him to ride," he said, committing to the plan despite current appearances, and Stephen, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with his arms folded and the particular expression he wore when he was containing considerable emotion, made the low, warm exhale that was his laugh, and Adelaide looked at her family in the lamplight of the January bedroom and thought that this was the fullest her life had ever been. Spring came back around, the way it does, with the cottonwoods turning green along the creek and the prairie grass coming up new, and the cattle beginning to move on the trail again. Adelaide was at the Saturday market in April with James Thomas in a basket behind her table, sleeping with the thorough, oblivious competence of a 3-month-old, and her preserves were the first of the spring, the elderberry and apple butter she had made in the fall and saved, and the women of Caldwell came to her table and admired the baby and bought the preserves, and Martha stood beside her and said, "You look absurdly happy, Adelaide," with the fondness of someone who is very glad to be right about something. "I am," Adelaide said. "I know it." "Good," Martha said, and bought 4 jars, which she did not need, and Adelaide knew it was because she wanted to and took the money with the grace due to genuine affection. Stephen arrived at the market at 9:30, same as always, and stood at the edge of her table with his coffee from the feed store woman, and looked at the baby and looked at Adelaide and looked at the row of jars with a complicated expression that contained the whole history of them in it. He picked up a jar of elderberry. He turned it over, he looked at it. "Do not," Adelaide said. "I was going to say it looks particularly good this year," he said with dignity. "You were going to buy it." "I was considering buying one," he said, "for the Hendersons. Henderson's youngest is apparently very fond of elderberry, according to Robert, who heard it from the Henderson boy at school." Adelaide looked at him. He looked back at her with absolute steadiness. "1 jar," she said. "1 jar," he agreed. She watched him purchase 1 jar of elderberry preserve with the careful deliberateness of a man who is maintaining a principle while technically violating it. And she thought about the first Saturday in July, 2 years before, when he had said he would take all 12. And she thought about everything between that moment and this one. The 130 jars and the first conversation and the apple orchard and the repaired fence and the Christmas and the ring on her hand and the baby in the basket. And the whole of it was extraordinary and ordinary in equal measure, the way the best things are. "Stephen," she said. He looked up from paying. "I love you," she said, because she said it when she felt it, plainly and without ceremony. And she felt it all the time, but sometimes the feeling was so specifically full that it needed to be said. He looked at her for a moment in the April market morning, with the cottonwood beginning to leaf along the creek and the cattle trail busy again, and their son sleeping in his basket, and their boy, Robert, somewhere at the other end of the market, probably purchasing something horse-related with his allowance. And the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in October when the careful neutrality had come away, and underneath It had been something that looked like hope held against the wind. It looked different now. Not hope against the wind, but something settled and lit, a lamp inside glass, steady and sure. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to say it more. Robert tells me I should." "Robert gives excellent advice," Adelaide said. "He does," Stephen agreed, with the parental combination of exasperation and pride that Adelaide had come to recognize as one of his most consistently endearing qualities. The morning went on around them, the market full and busy and loud, and the baby woke and was fed and went back to sleep, and Adelaide sold her jars one by one to the ladies of Caldwell, and Stephen stood at the edge of her table and talked to her between customers about the cattle and the spring grass, and the particular quality of the Cimarron light when it came over the bluffs in the morning. And the 2 hours of the market morning passed the way good time does, too quickly but completely. When the table was nearly clear, he helped her pack what remained and load the wagon with the same efficiency he had always had. And James Thomas woke again, and was passed to his father without ceremony, because Stephen held him with the easy confidence of a man who has held a baby before, and does not find it frightening. And the baby regarded his father from the basket of Stephen's arms with the profound, deep-eyed attention of someone receiving new information and filing it carefully. "He is thinking something very serious," Adelaide observed. "He is," Stephen agreed, looking at his son. "He has your expression." Stephen looked up at her. "He does not." "He absolutely does," she said. "That particular focused attention. He gets it from you." Stephen looked back at James Thomas, who was in fact deploying an expression of remarkable concentration, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Poor thing," he said softly, and Adelaide heard the love in it and thought that was entirely the right thing to say and entirely the wrong way to read it. "It is a very good expression," she said firmly. They drove home through the April morning, the wagon on the rutted road between the pastures coming into green, and Robert on midnight caught up with them, a mile from the ranch, having also been at the market, and rode alongside the wagon with the easy, comfortable horsemanship of a boy who has been riding since before he can properly remember, and talked about what he had seen, and who he had spoken to with the bright, comprehensive social interest of a 13-year-old, who is at the exact age when the world begins to seem enormously interesting in all directions. Adelaide listened to him and watched the Kansas spring opening up around them, and felt Stephen's arm against hers on the wagon seat, and heard James Thomas making the small contented sounds he made when he was awake and satisfied, and thought that this was her life, this specific morning on this specific road, this family she had not expected and had been given, and she held it clearly in her mind the way you hold things that are precious and specific and yours. The ranch came into view across the last of the pasture, the stone house and the good barns and the cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the south boundary, and Robert kicked midnight into a canter and went ahead with the energy of 13 years and a good horse on a spring morning, and Stephen drew the wagon team to a slight slowness, the way he sometimes did on the approach to the ranch, the way that said he was glad to be coming home. "Do you mind," Adelaide said, "that I still go to the market?" "Every Saturday." He looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who did not expect the question. "Of course not," he said. "It is yours. It has always been yours. I know some men might feel differently." "I am not some men," he said, and she supposed that was the most concise and accurate thing she had ever heard him say about himself. "No," she agreed, "you are not." He pulled the team up at the gate, and she looked at the ranch house and thought about the kitchen that was now also hers, and the orchard at the farm that was still hers, and the preserve shelf, and the Saturday table, and the jar in Stephen's coat pocket currently making its way to the youngest Henderson child. And she thought about Thomas again, briefly and gently, with the knowledge that he would have called this good and meant it. "Stephen," she said. He said, attending to the horses, "Do you remember when Robert told you at Christmas that you were going to propose to me?" He secured the reins and gave her a look. "I am unlikely to forget it." "He was right," she said. "He was," Stephen said, "and he has never let me hear the end of it." "I think," Adelaide said, with the smile that he had told her once, quietly in the particular honesty of late evening, was the thing he had fallen in love with first on that July Saturday before he had found any other words for it, that we should be grateful for good informants. He looked at her, and the morning was all around them, and he took her hand on the wagon seat. "Adelaide," he said, "I am grateful for everything." She held his hand and watched Robert unsaddle Midnight at the barn with the confident pleasure of a boy in his right place, and James Thomas was warm and solid in the basket at her feet, and the spring grass was green from one horizon to the other under the wide Kansas sky, and she thought yes. She thought, without qualification or reservation, yes to all of it. The Saturday after that she brought 18 jars to market, the most she had ever brought, because the spring was promising and she was already thinking about the summer harvest, the strawberries that would come in June and the wild plum and the peaches from the old orchard. And she had decided to expand, to take a second table at the market, and perhaps to see if the general store in town would carry her apple butter through the winter when the fresh things ran out. She had told Stephen this plan at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, walking him through the practical details with the brisk clarity she brought to plans that mattered, and he had listened with his full attention, the way he always listened, and when she was done he had said, "You will need more jars." She had looked at him. "I believe," he said, "that I gave you 12 for Christmas." "You did. That seems insufficient for an expansion." "It is insufficient for an expansion," she agreed. "I will see about more," he said, and picked up his coffee, and that was that. And she had spent a moment looking at his profile in the lamplight, and thinking that this was what it looked like, a partnership, and it looked right. He came home the following Tuesday with 48 good heavy glass jars in a wooden crate in the back of the wagon, which was considerably more than she had asked for and exactly the right thing. "You did not ask for that many," she said. "You will need them," he said. "The summer is promising." She had kissed him on the porch steps with James Thomas on her hip and the afternoon light going gold, and he had held her around the waist, and Robert, coming around the corner of the barn, had made a sound of theatrical suffering and kept walking, which made Adelaide laugh against Stephen's jaw. "He will get over it," Stephen said. "He will," Adelaide agreed. The summer of 1880 was in fact very promising. The best summer the Triple Bar Bee had seen in several years, and the best harvest Adelaide's farm orchard had produced since she had been managing it alone. The strawberries in June were extraordinary, deep red and sweet, and she put up 40 jars and sold every single one by the end of July. The wild plum came in heavy, and the peaches were the best they had been. And by August the preserve shelf in the ranch kitchen ran from one wall to the other, and Adelaide was discussing with Stephen whether they ought to put up a second shelf. 2 shelves, Robert said helpfully, from where he was sitting at the kitchen table with a book, demonstrating that he had learned his father's habit of making reasonable suggestions in the guise of minor practical ones. 2 shelves, Stephen confirmed, and went to get the timber. Adelaide stood in the kitchen and looked at her son Robert, who was nearly 14 and growing 2 inches a year, and was in every observable way the son of her heart, and at her husband, who was in the barn finding timber for shelves he would install with the same careful competence with which he installed everything, and at James Thomas, who was asleep in his cradle in the corner of the kitchen where she could see him. And she thought that a Saturday market and 12 jars of wild plum, and a man who could not think of a better excuse than buying something he did not like had led, by the particular generous logic of things, to exactly this. She thought about the loneliness of the farmhouse in winter, which had been real and which she had carried honestly, and she thought about the way the world sometimes gives you back what you feared was simply gone, not the same thing, because nothing is the same thing twice, but something real and its own and worth all the years of waiting. She picked up a jar of peach preserve and held it in the summer kitchen light, the amber of it clear and deep, and she thought about all the things you could pack into a jar and keep, the summer light and the labor and the sweetness of the fruit, all of it sealed under white cloth and held against the winter, and she thought that love was something like that too. You put into it what you had, all the care and the work and the honest daily attention, and it kept. It kept and it gave back. She set the jar down on the new shelf. Outside, she could hear Stephen in the barn and Robert talking to midnight, and the summer afternoon was warm on the windows, and James Thomas turned in his cradle and settled deeper into sleep. Adelaide Boone went to put on the kettle for the evening coffee and thought, with the clean and settled happiness of a woman who has arrived at the true chapter of her life, that some things begin with something as simple as 12 jars of preserve and end up being everything.